Roman Republic. The Roman Republic. And it was essentially an oligarchy, okay? So oligarchy just means rule by the few. So it's very much like Sparta. It is a war society. And at this point in history, the fact that the Roman Republic was an oligarchy, basically it had about 100 families that commanded it, okay? And these were called the patricians. It was actually to the advantage of Rome, because at this time, Rome was small. It was poor. It was at war, okay? So in other words, even though there was nobility, they were not that much better off than other people. And everyone knew each other. So they were very open, energetic, and cohesive society. And so over time, they became the most dominant society in the Mediterranean. They defeated Carthage, they defeated the Greeks. But now that they're an empire, the fact that Rome is an oligarchy is a huge problem, because now they are corrupt, unequal, and stagnant. And one way that we know is Roman women just started to refuse to have children. Okay, so they were dying as a society. And at this point in history, what should happen is that they should build an imperial bureaucracy, a centralized, standardized system in order to better manage the empire. But they couldn't really do that because of the oligarchy. The families, which now are about 50, okay, they refused to give up power. So rather than a centralized bureaucracy, the Roman Empire was in many ways a system in which different families had different territories. And what this led to was constant civil war, okay? Civil war. And remember, it started with Sulla, and then it went on to Julius Caesar. And after Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar became the first among equals. But he still failed to set up the bureaucracy. Okay? And so it kept on leading to war. Eventually, what happened was that Constantine decided, this system doesn't work, so what I need to do is I need to reinvent the Roman people. And you do that by moving the capital from Rome to a new place he calls Constantinople, okay? Which now becomes the Byzantine Empire. Okay? And the Byzantine Empire now, because it's a new culture, it can now become a bureaucracy. In fact, their official language becomes Greek. It's a Greek bureaucracy. Okay? And this is what we call the Second Rome. At the same time, while this is happening, you have a massive migration of the steppes people. Okay? They're coming into Europe from many different locations. Why is this happening? Because in China, the Han Dynasty is waging a war against the steppe nomadic people, okay? The people we call the Xiongnu. So they are forced westwards, which forces the other steppe people to migrate into Europe and into Central Asia. Okay? So these people are called the Goths. And this becomes a huge problem for Rome, because their people are not having children, and you have all these massive migration coming in from the steppes. And so what the Romans decided to do is divide and rule. And so what this means is that a lot of them are absorbed into the army as mercenaries and as soldiers in order to defend the border, in order to fight these civil wars. Now, remember last class we talked about the rise of the Catholic Church, okay? And we discussed how the Catholic Church was, in many ways, being supported by these noble families. Not all of them supported the Catholic Church, but some of them did. And those that did had a huge advantage because now what they can do is absorb these new migrants into their society, where they're at the top and the migrants are at the bottom, okay? Then the question then is, why would the migrants agree to this? The reason why is, in their society, it is very egalitarian. And for war purposes, they would elect a war leader, okay? But with this system, the Catholic Church system, this war leader can now become a nobility, okay? They can now join the 50 families to form a new nobility, okay? Does that make sense, guys? All right. So at this point in history, when Constantine sets up the Byzantine Empire, now the Roman Empire is going to divide into two: a western part and an eastern part. Okay. And these two parts are going to have very different fates. The eastern part is still part of the Middle East, okay? The Levant, Anatolia, Egypt, and so it is the wealthiest part of the empire. And as such, it engages in wars with the Persian Empire, okay? And this will define most of its history. Its capital, Constantinople, was designed to be invincible. You could not lay siege to it, you could not conquer it. And as such, the Byzantine Empire was stable. In fact, it lasted for about 1,000 years, which is very, very impressive. Okay, and as I said, it's very wealthy, and so therefore, it's really able to dominate the world through mainly trade and diplomacy. Okay, so it became an imperial bureaucracy. It fought wars, but it usually used a lot of mercenaries because it had a lot of wealth. Right? So that's the Eastern Empire. And guess what, guys? This is very similar to China, okay? So think about China when you think about the Byzantine Empire. They're not the same, but they're very similar in how they organize their society. The Western Empire is very different because this is the poorest part of Europe. The other thing about this region is that there are lots of natural barriers. And so you have like these competing societies emerging, okay? Different cultures, different societies, and they're protected by mountains, by forests, by rivers. So there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of diversity within the Western Empire. And so the power that emerges is actually the Catholic Church. And as Western Europe increases in power and Eastern Europe decreases in power, the Catholic Church will increase in power as well, okay? How did the Catholic Church come to dominate Western Europe? Because the Catholic Church believes it is out of history. Okay? So you kings, you compete for who rules the earth. But we, the Catholic Church, we decide who goes to heaven. Okay? So the Catholic Church becomes the dominant power in Western Europe. In fact, you can say that they are the empire now, but they are a spiritual empire, a divine empire that is out of history and which speaks for God. And as such, they become a very powerful empire as well. Okay? And this leads to tremendous conflicts throughout Western Europe. Okay? But there's a problem with the Catholic Church, and we discussed this last class. With the Catholic Church, it's trying to control the divine spark. Remember, Jesus came to tell us that there's a divine spark in us. And as long as we try to glow this divine spark, we can be with God. And the Catholic Church says, no, no, no. This divine spark, it is that of the devil. And we must imprison it. Okay? And this works most of the time, but now and then you have religious leaders who arise and said, no, no, no. The divine spark is within us. And so this leads to a lot of conflict. And ultimately, the solution the Catholic Church proposes is the idea of crusades, where warriors go and kill those who believe in the divine spark. And then they set up a secret police called the Inquisition in order to search for those who oppose the Catholic Church. Okay? The Inquisition, the major idea is, if you believe in the divine spark, you're not an evil person, you're a stupid person, because you don't know better. So the idea of the Inquisition is to educate you in the truth, which is the divine spark is that of Satan, that of the devil. And therefore, you must obey the Catholic Church. But if you insist on defying the Catholic Church, then you are a heretic. And therefore, you must burn at the stake before you can pollute other people. Okay? Now, eventually what will happen is that as a conflict in Western Europe gets worse and worse, certain states will break away from the control of the Catholic Church, and they will embrace a new religion called Protestantism, okay? And this is something we'll discuss next class. Okay, so that's the history of Western Europe.